Stand next to a skeleton of Homo habilis, one of our earliest ancestors, and you'd tower over them. We're talking about a creature that stood maybe 4.5 feet tall on a good day. Now look at the Netherlands, where the average man is over 6 feet tall. That's a difference of nearly 2 feet of human height gained over roughly 2 million years of evolution. But here's the thing that keeps anthropologists awake at night. Why did this happen? Why did humans become so tall? Think about it. We didn't need to be tall to survive. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, average around 4 feet, and they're doing just fine. Gorillas are incredibly powerful, and males top out at about 5.5 feet. So what happened to us? What evolutionary pressure? What environmental factor? What strange twist of fate took our ancestors from the height of a modern 10-year-old and stretched us into the tallest primates on Earth? The answer isn't simple. It's not one thing. It's a cascade of changes stretching across millions of years, involving everything from the shape of our hips to the invention of agriculture, from ice ages to industrial revolutions, from the proteins we ate to the diseases we survived. Human height is a mystery wrapped in our DNA, written in our bones, and scattered across continents and centuries. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love checking the comments and seeing Tokyo at dawn, London at midnight, all these different moments happening at once. Now, you might think height is just about genetics. Your parents were tall, so you're tall. Simple, right? Wrong. Genetics only tells about 80% of the story, and even that 80% involves hundreds, maybe thousands, of different genes all interacting in ways we're only beginning to understand. The other 20%, that's where things get really interesting. Nutrition, disease, climate, stress, even how much sunlight you got as a child, all of it matters. But it gets stranger. Human height hasn't increased steadily over time like you might expect. It's gone up and down like a roller coaster. There were periods in our evolutionary history when humans were actually getting shorter, not taller. Medieval Europeans were shorter than their Roman ancestors. Early farmers were shorter than the hunter-gatherers they descended from. And then, suddenly, in just the last 150 years, humans in developed countries have shot up in height faster than at any other point in our entire evolutionary history. The average human today is about 4 to 6 inches taller than their ancestors from just 1850. That's not evolution. That's something else entirely. That's environmental. That's nutritional. That's the story of civilization itself written in the length of our bones. See, height is like a biological report card for a society. It tells you if children are getting enough food, enough protein, enough vitamins. It tells you if diseases are being controlled. It tells you about inequality, because even in wealthy countries, poorer children tend to be shorter than wealthier ones. Height is honest. You can't fake it. Your bones don't lie about the conditions you grew up in. And here's what makes this topic perfect for a deep dive tonight. Height touches everything. To understand why humans are tall, we have to understand how we learned to walk upright, how our brains got bigger, how we mastered fire and cooking, how we survived ice ages, how we invented farming, how we built cities, how we conquered diseases, how we spread across the entire planet. Height is a thread that runs through the entire tapestry of human evolution and history. Right now, there are countries where the average height is still increasing, and countries where it's plateauing or even decreasing. There are populations separated by just a few hundred miles with average height differences of 6 inches or more. North and South Korea, genetically nearly identical, now have an average height gap of several inches after just 70 years of separation. That's not genetics, that's everything else. So as you drift off tonight, we're going to take a journey. We're going back millions of years to meet our short, tree-dwelling ancestors. We're going to watch them come down from the trees and stand upright. We're going to see how their diet changed, how their bodies responded, how their skeletons rebuilt themselves generation after generation. We're going to witness the agricultural revolution that paradoxically made humans shorter. We're going to experience the modern height explosion that made us taller than ever before. And through it all, we're going to answer that central question. Why did humans become so tall? The answer is going to surprise you. Let's begin at the very beginning, with our ancient ancestors, who looked up at the world from a very different perspective. Let's go back, way back. Not just thousands of years, but millions. Back to when our ancestors weren't anything like the tall, upright creatures we are today. Back to when being human meant something completely different. Picture East Africa, roughly 3.5 million years ago. The landscape is a mosaic of forests and grasslands, rivers cutting through volcanic plains. And walking through this world, moving cautiously between trees, are some of the strangest creatures you've ever seen. They're called Australopithecus, and they're about the size of a modern 8-year-old child. 3 feet tall, maybe 3.5 if they're particularly robust. Males might reach 4 feet on a good day, that's it. Your earliest identifiable ancestors were barely tall enough to see over tall grass. Now, if you encountered one of these individuals, you wouldn't immediately recognize them as human. Their faces were more ape-like than human, with prominent jaws and small brains. Their arms were long relative to their legs, better suited for climbing than most modern humans. But here's the thing, they walked upright. Not perfectly, not with the efficient stride you use every day, but they were bipedal. And that choice, that commitment to two-legged locomotion, would eventually make height possible. But for now, being small was actually an advantage. Australopithecus lived in a dangerous world. Predators were everywhere. Large cats, hyenas, crocodiles in the rivers, even giant eagles that could carry off a juvenile. Being small meant needing less food. It meant being able to climb trees quickly when danger approached. It meant you could hide in places larger creatures couldn't reach. Evolution doesn't optimize for height, it optimizes for survival. And for millions of years, survival meant staying small. The fossil evidence tells us this wasn't just one species at one height. Different Australopithecus species showed remarkable variation. Some populations were tiny, barely 3 feet tall, living in forested environments where being small was advantageous. Others were slightly larger, maybe 4 feet, living in more open grasslands where a little extra height helped spot predators. But none of them were what we'd call tall. Not even close. Compare them to modern great apes, and the similarities are striking. Modern chimpanzees stand about 3 to 4 feet tall when upright. Bonobos are similar. Even gorillas, despite their massive bulk and muscle mass, rarely exceed 5.5 feet. Our early ancestors fit right into this range. They were living in the same environments, facing similar challenges, and their bodies reflected those constraints. Being small was the ape way. It had worked for millions of years. Then something started to change. Around 2 million years ago, a new kind of human appeared in the fossil record, Homo erectus. And these individuals were different. They were taller, significantly taller. Males averaged around 5 feet 3 inches, with some individuals reaching 5'9". Females were shorter, averaging about 5 feet, but still much taller than any Australopithecus. This might not sound impressive by modern standards, but it represents a massive evolutionary shift. In less than 1 million years, human ancestors had gained more than a foot in height. Why? What changed? The answer is written in the fossils themselves, but you have to know how to read them. Paleontologists don't just measure skeleton height and call it a day. They examine bone density, look at muscle attachment points, analyze the proportions of different body parts. Every bone tells a story about how that individual lived, what they ate, how they moved through their environment. Homo erectus bones tell a story of transformation. Their leg bones are longer, more robust, designed for covering long distances efficiently. Their spines show adaptations for sustained upright posture, not the semi-hunched stance of earlier hominids. Their rib cages are narrower, more barrel-shaped, optimized for breathing while running rather than climbing. These weren't just taller apes. These were the first humans built for life in open country, far from the safety of trees. And here's where it gets really interesting. This increase in height wasn't random. It wasn't just genetic drift, populations getting taller by accident. It was driven by intense evolutionary pressure. Climate change, The same force that nearly wiped out humans hundreds of thousands of years later was transforming Africa. Forests were shrinking, grasslands were expanding. The old strategy of staying small and tree-dependent wasn't working anymore. Taller individuals had advantages in this new world. They could see farther across open grasslands, spotting predators and prey from greater distances. They could move more efficiently, covering more ground with each stride while searching for food and water. They could carry food and tools more easily, their longer arms and upright posture creating natural carrying capacity. Most importantly, they could regulate their body temperature better in hot, exposed environments. Taller bodies with more surface area relative to volume meant better heat dissipation, crucial for surviving on the African savanna. But there was a trade-off. Everything in evolution is a trade-off. Being taller meant needing more food. A 5-foot-tall Homo erectus required significantly more calories than a 3-foot-tall Australopithecus. In an environment where food wasn't guaranteed, this was a serious risk. You can't just decide to be tall without having a plan for feeding that extra height. Homo erectus solved this problem through technology and diet. They became hunters, not just scavengers. They developed better stone tools, sharp enough to butcher large animals efficiently. They learned to use fire, which meant they could cook food, extracting more calories from the same raw materials. They organized into cooperative hunting groups, working together to bring down prey that no single individual could handle. All of these innovations supported their increased height by making high-quality nutrition more accessible. The fossil record shows this transition playing out over hundreds of thousands of years. Early Homo erectus specimens from about 1.9 million years ago show the beginning of height increases, but they're still relatively short, maybe 4'9". Later specimens from 1.5 million years ago are noticeably taller, consistently exceeding 5 feet. By a million years ago, some populations had reached heights that wouldn't look out of place in many modern populations. But here's what's fascinating. Not all Homo erectus populations were the same height. Fossils from different regions show significant variation. Populations in East Africa tended to be taller, with longer limbs adapted for heat dissipation in hot, dry climates. Populations in Southeast Asia were shorter, with more robust builds, possibly adaptations to different environmental pressures or different available resources. Height wasn't just increasing universally, it was diversifying, different populations finding different optimal sizes for their specific circumstances. This tells us something crucial about human evolution. Height isn't destiny. It's not like there's one perfect human height that evolution was aiming for. Instead, height is flexible, responsive to environmental conditions, available nutrition, and survival pressures. The same species, with the same basic genetic toolkit, could produce individuals ranging from 5 feet to nearly 6 feet, depending on where and how they lived. And this flexibility would prove absolutely critical during the crisis we talked about earlier. When that chromosomal fusion occurred around 900,000 years ago, human ancestors weren't all one uniform height. They were a variable, adaptable species, with populations at different sizes scattered across multiple environments. Some of those populations were tall, taking advantage of abundant resources in favorable territories. Others were shorter, living in marginal environments where every calorie counted. When the climate disaster hit and populations plummeted to just 1,280 individuals, that variation became a survival advantage. The survivors came from different populations with different body plans. Some were tall, some were short, some were built for speed, others for endurance. This genetic diversity, including variation in genes controlling height, gave the bottleneck population multiple options for adapting to rapidly changing conditions. Over those brutal 117,000 years, selection pressures changed constantly. Sometimes being taller was advantageous, maybe during periods when the scattered groups could access better hunting territories. Sometimes being shorter helped, requiring fewer calories during the worst droughts and famines. The survivors were the ones whose bodies could adapt, whose genetics allowed flexibility in response to changing conditions. By the time the bottleneck ended and human populations began expanding again, around 813,000 years ago. They carried genes for a wide range of body sizes and proportions. This wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature, a survival mechanism developed through hundreds of thousands of years of environmental chaos. Our ancestors learned, at the genetic level, that flexibility in body size was more valuable than optimization for one specific height. And that lesson is still written in our DNA today. Modern human populations show remarkable height variation, from the tall Nilotic peoples of East Africa, averaging over 6 feet, to the historically shorter populations of Southeast Asia. All of us are descendants of those bottleneck survivors, all carrying the same basic genetic potential for height, but expressing it differently depending on our environment, nutrition, and evolutionary history. So when we ask how tall were the first humans, the answer is complicated. Our earliest bipedal ancestors were tiny, barely 3 feet tall. The first humans who looked somewhat like us, Homo erectus, were much taller, averaging around 5 feet. But more importantly, they were variable. They showed us that human height isn't fixed. It's a flexible trait, constantly responding to the world around us. And the story was just beginning, because the forces that shaped our ancestors' height, climate, diet, disease, environment, those forces never stopped working. They're still shaping us today, still pushing and pulling at human height in ways we're only beginning to understand. What happened next would take those early humans, already dramatically taller than their ape ancestors, and transform them into something even more remarkable. But that transformation required one crucial change, a change in how they moved through the world. But before we get to height, we need to talk about standing up in the first place. Because none of this, not the tall bodies, not the long legs, not the upright spine, none of it makes sense until you understand the single most important transformation in human evolution. The moment our ancestors decided to stand on 2 legs instead of 4. This wasn't sudden. Evolution doesn't work that way. But somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago, in the forests and woodlands of East Africa, something extraordinary began happening. Our ancestors started spending more time upright, not all the time at first. They were still excellent climbers, still spent significant time in trees. But increasingly, when they moved across the ground, they did it on 2 legs instead of 4. Why? That's one of the biggest debates in paleoanthropology. And the honest answer is, we're still not entirely sure. But we have some compelling theories, and the evidence written in fossil bones tells us exactly what happened to the body when our ancestors made this choice, what it cost them, and what it gained them. The traditional explanation goes like this. Africa's climate was changing. Forests were fragmenting, giving way to more open woodlands and grasslands. Our ancestors needed to move between scattered tree patches to find food. Walking upright was more energy efficient than knuckle walking like chimpanzees, especially over longer distances. Stand up, and you could see over tall grass to spot predators or food sources. You could carry things, food, tools, infants, in your newly freed hands. All of this is probably true. But recent research suggests something even more interesting might have been happening. Some anthropologists now think bipedalism evolved partly because it helped with thermoregulation. Stand upright in the midday sun, and you expose much less body surface area to direct sunlight. Your head is higher up where breezes can cool you. You can move across open ground in the hottest part of the day, when most predators are resting. This might sound minor, but remember, big brains generate tremendous heat. As our ancestors' brains began growing, they faced a serious cooling problem. Bipedalism helped solve it. By reducing sun exposure and improving cooling efficiency, standing upright made it possible to support larger, more energy-hungry brains without literally cooking them inside the skull. But here's what's really wild. The anatomical changes required for bipedalism were massive. We're not talking about minor tweaking. We're talking about fundamental reconstruction of the entire skeleton from the ground up. Start with the feet. Our ancestors had grasping feet like modern apes, with opposable big toes perfect for gripping branches. Bipedalism required transforming these into rigid platforms capable of supporting the entire body's weight. The big toe rotated to align with the other toes, creating a unified pushing surface. The arch developed, acting like a spring to absorb impact and store energy during walking. The heel bone enlarged and reinforced to handle the shock of repeated heel strikes. These changes took millions of years and came with serious trade-offs. Ape feet can grasp, manipulate objects, provide extra stability in trees. Human feet can do basically one thing well: walk and run on two legs. But they do that one thing spectacularly. Human feet are masterpieces of mechanical engineering, capable of carrying us efficiently across virtually any terrain. Move up to the legs. In quadrupedal apes, the legs are relatively short and angled outward. The knee joints are designed for climbing and occasional short bursts of upright movement. For full-time bipedalism, everything had to change. The femur, the thigh bone, grew longer and angled inwards so the knees came closer together under the body's center of mass. This created the distinctive knocked knee angle you see in human skeletons. It looks awkward, but it's essential for efficient bipedal walking. It keeps your center of gravity over your supporting foot with each step, minimizing the energy needed to stay balanced. The knee joint itself was completely restructured. In apes, it's relatively small and mobile, designed for the varied movements of climbing. In humans, it became large, robust, and stabilized. The human knee has to handle enormous forces, multiple times your body weight with every step, even more when running or jumping. It's also one of the most commonly injured joints in the human body. Evolution's design works, but it's operating right at the edge of what's mechanically possible. Then there's the pelvis, and this is where things get really interesting. The pelvis had to solve multiple contradictory problems simultaneously. It needed to support the entire weight of the upper body and transfer it down to the legs. It needed to provide attachment points for the powerful muscles required for bipedal locomotion. And in females, it needed to remain wide enough for childbirth, even as everything else was being restructured for walking efficiency. The solution evolution came up with is honestly kind of miraculous. The pelvis became shorter and broader, creating a bowl shape that supports the internal organs. The hip sockets rotated to point more sideways, improving leverage for the muscles that stabilize the body during walking. The entire structure tilted, changing the angle of the spine and repositioning the body's center of mass over the hips. But this created what anthropologists call the obstetrical dilemma. A wider pelvis is better for childbirth but worse for walking efficiency. A narrower pelvis is better for walking but makes childbirth more difficult. The compromise evolution reached is why human childbirth is so difficult compared to other primates. Our babies have to navigate a complex twisted birth canal that's barely large enough to accommodate their heads. It's also why human babies are born relatively helpless compared to other mammals. They have to be born before their heads get too large to fit through the birth canal, even though this means they're completely dependent on parental care for years. The spine underwent its own dramatic transformation. Ape spines are relatively straight, forming a gentle C-curve from top to bottom. This works fine when you're on all fours, with your weight distributed across 4 limbs. But stand upright, and that spine would collapse under the weight of your upper body. Human spines developed a distinctive S-curve. The lower back curves inward, creating what's called lumbar lordosis. The upper back curves outward, then the neck curves inward again. These curves act like springs, distributing forces and absorbing shock. They also position your head directly over your pelvis, minimizing the muscular effort needed to stay upright. But this elegant solution came with consequences. Lower back pain is nearly universal in human populations. Herniated discs, spinal stenosis, chronic pain. These are the prices we pay for walking upright. Evolution doesn't optimize for comfort or longevity. It optimizes for reproduction. As long as the spine holds together long enough for you to raise your children, natural selection doesn't care if you spend your later years in pain. The skull and neck joints also had to change. In quadrupedal animals, the skull attaches to the spine at the back of the head. The neck muscles have to constantly fight gravity to hold the head up. Stand upright, and you can reposition that attachment point to the bottom of the skull. Now the head balance is on top of the spine, requiring minimal muscular effort to maintain. This change is so distinctive that paleoanthropologists can determine whether a fossil species was bipedal just by looking at the foramen magnum, the hole where the spine enters the skull. Forward positioned, bipedal. Back positioned, quadrupedal. It's that simple. All of these changes, feet, legs, pelvis, spine, skull, they didn't happen at once. The fossil record shows a gradual transition over millions of years. Early bipedal species like Ardipithecus and Australopithecus were still partly adapted for tree climbing. They had long arms, curved fingers, and relatively short legs. They could walk upright, but they weren't specialized for it the way later humans would be. By the time Homo erectus appeared around 2 million years ago, bipedalism was fully refined. Long legs, short arms, modern body proportions. These were humans built for walking, built for covering serious distances on 2 legs with maximum efficiency. And this is where height enters the story. Because once you're fully committed to bipedalism, once your entire skeleton is restructured for upright walking, increasing height becomes advantageous in ways it never was before. Longer legs mean a longer stride, which means you can cover more ground with less energy expenditure. Studies of modern humans show that taller individuals are more efficient walkers, using less energy per mile traveled. In a world where food was scarce and territories were large, this efficiency advantage was huge. Taller bodies also provide better thermoregulation in hot climates. More surface area relative to body volume means better heat dissipation. Combined with upright posture reducing sun exposure, height became a crucial adaptation for surviving in the hot, open environments where humans were evolving. There's also the intimidation factor. Taller individuals are perceived as more threatening by predators and competitors. In a world full of dangerous animals and competing human groups, looking bigger provided real survival advantages. But perhaps most importantly, the biomechanical changes of bipedalism removed many of the constraints that had limited height in earlier primates. Once the pelvis, legs, and spine were restructured for upright walking, adding height was relatively straightforward. Just make the leg bones longer, strengthen the supporting structures proportionally, and you get a taller human without fundamentally compromising the system. This is why Homo erectus, appearing around 2 million years ago, showed a dramatic increase in height compared to earlier human ancestors. Some individuals reached 6 feet tall, comparable to modern humans. They had long legs, narrow hips, and body proportions adapted for efficient long-distance walking in open environments. The transition to bipedalism didn't just change how humans moved, it changed what was possible. It freed the hands for tool use and carrying. It improved energy efficiency for long-distance travel. It enabled better temperature regulation. And crucially, it removed the structural barriers that had kept earlier primates relatively short. Standing up, it turned out, was the first step toward becoming tall. Everything that came after, the dietary changes, the genetic adaptations, the environmental pressures, all of it built on the foundation created when our ancestors first decided to walk on 2 legs instead of 4. It was a decision that cost us our tree climbing abilities, gave us chronic back pain, and made childbirth dramatically more difficult. But it also set us on the path to becoming the most successful large mammal species on the planet. Not bad for just standing up. Picture this. Your ancestors 50,000 years ago, waking up in a world where food isn't something you buy at a store or even grow in a field. It's something you have to find, chase, dig up, or negotiate with nature to obtain. Every single calorie is earned through skill, knowledge, and a little bit of luck. And here's the wild part. They were probably taller than you. That doesn't make sense, does it? We have grocery stores, vitamin supplements, food fortification programs. We've conquered agriculture, developed sophisticated food processing techniques, created global supply chains that can deliver fresh salmon from Norway to your dinner plate in Tokyo. How could people who lived hand to mouth, never knowing where their next meal was coming from, possibly have been taller than modern humans with all our nutritional advantages? The answer tells us something profound about what human bodies actually need to grow tall and strong. And it reveals one of the great paradoxes of human history. The invention of agriculture, probably the most important technological revolution in human history, actually made us shorter for thousands of years. Let's start with what your hunter-gatherer ancestors were actually eating. Forget the Hollywood version of cavemen gnawing on half-raw meat while grunting at each other. The archaeological evidence paints a much more sophisticated picture. Hunter-gatherers were eating what anthropologists call a mixed subsistence diet. Meat, yes, but also nuts, seeds, fruits, leafy greens, roots, tubers, shellfish, bird eggs, honey when they could find it, and dozens of other foods depending on what region they lived in and what season it was. The meat component was crucial, not because humans are obligate carnivores, we're not, but because meat provided something that's incredibly difficult to get from plant sources alone. Complete protein with all the essential amino acids, plus highly bioavailable forms of key nutrients. Iron that your body can actually absorb efficiently. Vitamin B12, which doesn't exist in plant foods at all. Zinc, which plays a critical role in growth and immune function. And the big one for height. Vitamin D and calcium in forms your body can use to build strong, long bones. But here's what's really interesting. Hunter-gatherers weren't just eating more meat than agricultural peoples would later consume. They were eating better meat. The wild animals they hunted, mammoths, deer, wild cattle, they were lean, muscular, nothing like modern domesticated livestock. Their meat had higher protein content, lower fat, and better fatty acid profiles. More omega-3s, fewer omega-6s, the kind of nutritional composition that modern diet gurus pay premium prices to recreate. And the plant foods they gathered weren't like modern cultivated varieties either. Wild plants tend to be more nutrient-dense than their domesticated descendants. A wild apple is smaller, tougher, more sour, and packed with exponentially more vitamins and minerals than the sweet, watery supermarket varieties we've bred for taste and shelf life. Wild greens contain more calcium, more iron, more of basically everything except sugar and starch. The combination created a nutritional profile that was almost perfectly suited for maximizing human growth. High protein intake supporting muscle and bone development. Abundant micronutrients from diverse plant sources. Plenty of calcium and vitamin D for skeletal growth. Enough calories to support a large, energy-hungry body without the empty carbohydrates that would later dominate agricultural diets. Skeletal remains from hunter-gatherer populations tell the story clearly. Men averaging 5'9" to 5'10", women around 5'5" to 5'6". These are heights that most modern populations didn't reach again until the 20th century. Some particularly well-fed hunter-gatherer groups were even taller. Paleo-Indian populations in North America, living in game-rich environments, show average heights that would be impressive even today. But there was another factor at play. Hunter-gatherers didn't just have good nutrition. They had consistent nutrition, at least more consistent than you might expect. The stereotype of feast or famine is partly true. Sometimes food was abundant, sometimes scarce. But the diversity of their diet acted as an insurance policy. If game was scarce, they could rely more heavily on gathered plants. If the plant foods failed in one season, there were usually alternatives. Roots when fruits weren't available, shellfish when hunting was poor. This dietary diversity meant children were less likely to experience the prolonged periods of malnutrition that stunt growth. Yes, there were lean times, but rarely complete nutritional collapse. And here's the key point for height. Most of your adult height is determined during a few critical growth periods. Infancy, early childhood, and adolescence. If you get adequate nutrition during those windows, you'll likely reach your genetic height potential. Miss those windows, and you'll be permanently shorter than your genes intended, no matter how well you eat as an adult. Hunter-gatherer children, on average, were hitting those nutritional targets more consistently than the agricultural children who would come later. Not because they had more food, sometimes they had less total calories, but because the quality of their food, the protein density, the micronutrient content was so much higher. Then came the revolution that changed everything. Around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, a little later in other parts of the world, humans figured out how to plant seeds deliberately, how to save some of this year's harvest to grow next year's crop, how to domesticate animals that could be raised and slaughtered on demand. Agriculture was born, and human height collapsed. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural sites tells a story of dramatic decline. Skeletal remains show people getting shorter, generation by generation. In some regions, the average height dropped by 5 or 6 inches within just a few thousand years. Men who would have stood 5'9" as hunter-gatherers were now averaging 5'3" or 5'er as farmers. Women dropped from 5'5" to barely 5 feet tall. Why? What went wrong? They had stable food supplies, reliable harvests, the ability to feed larger populations. Shouldn't that have made people healthier, taller, stronger? The problem was monotony. Early agricultural diets were dominated by just 1 or 2 staple crops. Wheat and barley in the Middle East, rice in Asia, corn in the Americas. These crops provided calories, lots of them, which is why populations exploded. But they didn't provide balanced nutrition. Grains are carbohydrate powerhouses, great for energy, terrible for pretty much everything else. They're relatively low in protein compared to meat. The protein they do contain is often incomplete, missing key amino acids. They're low in bioavailable calcium and iron. The iron that is present comes bound to compounds called phytates that actually prevent your body from absorbing it efficiently. They contain almost no vitamin B12, no vitamin D unless you're getting sun exposure, inadequate zinc, and the list goes on. Early farmers were eating more food than their hunter-gatherer ancestors in terms of sheer calories. But they were getting less nutrition. Children growing up on grain-heavy diets weren't hitting their growth potential. They weren't getting enough protein during critical developmental windows. They weren't getting enough calcium to build long, strong bones. They were consuming calories but experiencing what nutritionists call hidden hunger, starvation for specific nutrients even while their bellies were full. The bones tell the story with brutal clarity. Skeletal remains from early agricultural populations show increased markers of malnutrition. Harris lines, dense bands in long bones that form when growth is interrupted by starvation or illness. Porous bone conditions suggesting iron deficiency anemia. Dental problems indicating childhood malnutrition. And everywhere, shorter stature. But it gets worse. Agriculture didn't just change what people ate. It changed how they lived in ways that further impacted height. Agricultural settlements were more crowded than hunter-gatherer camps. More people living closer together. And where you have dense populations, you get disease. Infectious diseases that spread from person to person thrived in early farming communities in ways they never could among scattered hunter-gatherer bands. Children suffering from repeated infections don't grow as tall. Their bodies divert resources from growth to immune function. Chronic low-grade illness during childhood can steal inches from adult height just as effectively as malnutrition. And early farming communities were disease factories. Measles, smallpox, influenza, all the crowd diseases that would later devastate populations around the world. They were born in agricultural settlements where humans, domesticated animals, and disease vectors all lived in close proximity. So you had a double hit, worse nutrition plus more disease, both stunting growth, both making each generation shorter than the last. For thousands of years, this continued. The archaeological record shows human height bottoming out around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago in many regions. This was the low point, when humans were shorter than they had been at any time in the previous 50,000 years. But then, slowly, things began to improve. Not everywhere, not all at once, but gradually, agricultural techniques advanced. Farmers learned to grow multiple crops, diversifying their diets. They began keeping livestock not just for meat but for dairy, adding crucial calcium and vitamin D back into their diets. Trade networks expanded, allowing regions to exchange foods, balancing out nutritional deficiencies. The Romans, at the height of their power, had access to an empire-spanning trade system that brought fish from Britannia, olive oil from Hispania, grain from Egypt. Their soldiers, fed on varied military rations, averaged around 5'7", shorter than hunter-gatherers, but notably taller than early farmers. Better diet, better height. The connection was undeniable. But the real recovery wouldn't begin until much later. It would take the scientific understanding of nutrition, the development of more productive agricultural varieties, improvements in food preservation and distribution. It would take the modern world. And when it finally came, humans would shoot up in height faster than at any other time in history. But that's a story for later. For now, remember this. Your tall body, if you're lucky enough to have inherited height, isn't just a product of your genes. It's a product of 10,000 years of slowly relearning what your hunter-gatherer ancestors knew instinctively. That to grow tall and strong, you need more than just calories. You need nutrition, the complete package of proteins, vitamins, and minerals that your bones and muscles require. And you need it consistently, especially during those critical childhood years when your body is reaching for the sky. The farmers eventually figured it out, but it took millennia. And every one of those years, people were living shorter than they could have been, all because we'd traded the nutritional diversity of hunting and gathering for the stability of agriculture. Sometimes progress comes with a price, and for thousands of years that price was measured in lost inches. Here's something that might surprise you. When you look at yourself in the mirror, about 80% of your height was decided before you were even born. Not by your diet, not by your environment, not by whether your parents made you drink milk every morning. By your genes. The DNA you inherited from thousands of generations of ancestors, all the way back to those bottleneck survivors we talked about earlier. But it's not simple. It's never simple with human genetics. You might think height would be controlled by one or two genes. Tall gene, short gene, flip a coin, see what happens. That's not even close to how it works. Height is what geneticists call a polygenic trait, meaning it's influenced by hundreds, possibly thousands of different genes, all working together in ways we're only beginning to understand. As of the latest genetic studies, researchers have identified over 700 specific genetic variants that influence human height. 700. And they suspect there are hundreds more they haven't found yet. Variants with smaller effects that are harder to detect but still contribute to the overall picture. Each of these genes does something different. Some affect bone growth during childhood. Others influence the production of growth hormones. Some determine when your growth plates close, ending your vertical development forever. Others affect cartilage formation, spinal development, even the length of individual vertebrae. Think of it like building a skyscraper. You don't just need one good engineer. You need architects, construction workers, materials suppliers, electricians, plumbers, hundreds of different specialists all coordinating their efforts. Miss one critical step, and the whole building might end up shorter than planned. Get everything right, and you reach maximum height. That's what's happening inside your body during the years you're growing. Hundreds of genes activating at precise times, producing specific proteins, triggering cellular processes that gradually stretch your skeleton upward. It's an incredibly complex dance of molecular biology, and the choreography was written millions of years ago. But here's where it gets really interesting. Those 700+ height genes aren't distributed randomly across human populations. Different groups have different combinations, different frequencies of height increasing or height decreasing variants. And these differences tell us stories about human history, about how our ancestors adapted to different environments over hundreds of thousands of years. Take Northern Europeans, for instance. On average, they're among the tallest people on Earth. Dutchmen average about 6 feet tall, Scandinavians not far behind. Genetic studies show these populations have unusually high frequencies of height-increasing genetic variants. But why? This didn't happen randomly. Natural selection was at work, favoring taller individuals in these environments, for reasons we can only partially reconstruct. Maybe height provided advantages in colder climates, where larger bodies retain heat more efficiently. Maybe it was sexual selection, with cultural preferences for taller partners gradually shifting the genetic makeup of populations. Maybe it was dietary, with populations that had access to protein-rich foods, like dairy being able to fully express height-promoting genes that would have been suppressed in populations with less nutrition. The answer is probably all of the above, plus factors we haven't even considered yet. Evolution rarely has just one reason for anything. Compare that to populations from equatorial regions. Many groups native to tropical Africa, Southeast Asia, or South America show different genetic profiles. Not fewer height genes, but different variants, combinations that typically produce shorter average statures. Again, natural selection probably played a role. In hot, humid environments, smaller bodies have advantages. They dissipate heat more efficiently. They require fewer calories to maintain. A huge advantage in environments where food can be scarce or unpredictable. They move more easily through dense forest vegetation. These aren't inferior genetics. They're adaptations, solutions to different environmental challenges. The same evolutionary processes that made Northern Europeans tall made other populations shorter, each group optimizing for their specific circumstances. But the genetic story of human height goes back much further than a few thousand years of regional adaptation. It goes back to our deep evolutionary history, to the genetic changes that separated us from other primates, and eventually made us the tallest apes on the planet. When you compare human DNA to chimpanzee DNA, which diverged from our lineage about 6 million years ago, you find something fascinating. Many of the genes that influence human height have accumulated mutations that distinguish us from our closest relatives. These aren't random changes. They're clustered in genes related to limb development, skeletal growth, and body proportions. This tells us that height has been under active evolutionary selection throughout human history. Our ancestors weren't just passively getting taller or shorter based on environmental conditions. Their genes were being actively modified, refined, adjusted by natural selection to produce bodies that could succeed in increasingly challenging environments. Remember those early hominins walking upright across the African savanna? Their descendants got taller over time, generation by generation, as mutations that promoted leg length and vertical stature spread through populations. Why? Because on the open grasslands, height provides visibility. Taller individuals could spot predators earlier, see game animals from greater distances, monitor the movement of potential threats and opportunities across the landscape. But it wasn't a straight line upward. Different human species evolved different height profiles. Homo erectus, one of our earliest ancestors, was already quite tall, with some individuals reaching 5'9" or more, comparable to modern humans. But Homo floresiensis, the famous hobbits, discovered on an Indonesian island, averaged only about 3'6" as adults. They had evolved extreme shortness as an adaptation to island life, where smaller body size is often advantageous due to limited resources. The genetic mechanisms behind these changes are starting to become clear. Recent studies have identified specific mutations in genes like FGFR3, which regulates bone growth, and IGF-1, which influences growth hormone signaling. Variations in these genes can cause significant height differences. Some variants increase the duration of childhood growth. Others affect how efficiently the body responds to growth hormones. Still others modify the timing of puberty, which indirectly affects final adult height by changing when growth plates close. But here's what's really wild. These genes don't just work independently. They interact with each other in complex networks. A variant in one gene might increase height, but only if you also have specific variants in 3 other genes. Another variant might normally increase height but actually decrease it if combined with certain dietary factors or environmental conditions. Geneticists call this epistasis, the phenomenon where genes influence each other's effects. It makes predicting height from DNA alone incredibly difficult. Even if you sequence someone's entire genome and identified all their height-related variants, you still couldn't predict their exact height with perfect accuracy. Too many interactions, too many environmental factors, too much complexity. But you could predict their genetic potential, the range within which their height will likely fall given adequate nutrition and health. And that potential varies dramatically between populations based on the specific combinations of height variants they carry. Recent genetic studies have revealed something else remarkable. Height genes have been evolving much faster than most other human traits. When researchers analyze ancient DNA from human remains thousands of years old, they can track how height-related genetic variants have changed frequency over time, and the changes are substantial. In Northern Europe, for example, height-increasing variants became dramatically more common over just the last 5,000 years. This wasn't just natural selection. It was probably also gene flow, populations migrating and mixing, bringing different genetic variants into contact and creating new combinations. The result was a rapid genetic shift toward taller average statures, a shift that's still visible in modern populations. But the opposite happened elsewhere. In some Asian populations, height variants shifted toward shorter average statures during the same period. Not because shorter people were inherently more successful, but because local conditions, dietary patterns, disease environments, and cultural factors created selection pressures that favored different body sizes. This is the beautiful complexity of human genetics. We're all carrying variants that were selected for under specific historical conditions. Some of those variants still provide advantages. Others are neutral now, relics of past selection pressures that no longer apply. And some might actually be disadvantageous in modern environments but persist because evolution is slow and selection is weak. Your height is a genetic story written across hundreds of thousands of years. Every inch of your stature carries echoes of ancient adaptations, of environments your ancestors survived, of selection pressures that shape their bodies and their DNA. The tall genes that Northern Europeans carry were selected for during Ice Age Europe. The different variants common in African populations were refined during hundreds of thousands of years of adaptation to tropical environments. The unique combinations found in Asian populations reflect entirely different evolutionary histories. We're all products of these deep genetic histories, all carrying different pieces of the human height puzzle. And because of sexual reproduction, which shuffles genetic variants every generation, no two people, except identical twins, carry exactly the same combination of height genes. Your particular genetic blueprint for height is unique, the result of thousands of generations of random recombination and selection. But genes are only part of the story. That 80% genetic determination of height we started with. It's accurate, but it leaves 20% unaccounted for. And that 20% can make a huge difference. Because genes provide potential, but environment determines whether that potential is realized. And as we'll see next, the environmental factors that influence height have changed more in the last 200 years than in the previous 200,000. The genetic blueprint is written, but whether it gets fully expressed depends on everything that happens after conception. Here's something remarkable. Take two people, both descended from the same African ancestors, both carrying genes from those 1,280 bottleneck survivors. Put one family line in Norway for 50,000 years. Put the other in Indonesia. And their bodies will transform in completely different ways. Not just skin color, though that changes too. Their entire physical structure will adapt. Height, build, limb proportions, even the shape of their torsos. All responding to the demands of the environment they inhabit. This isn't speculation. It's biology, documented, and measured across populations worldwide. And it's governed by principles that apply to almost every warm-blooded animal on the planet. In 1847, a German biologist named Christian Bergmann noticed something curious about animal species. Populations of the same species living in colder climates tended to be larger than those in warmer regions. Bears in Alaska were bigger than bears in Mexico. Wolves in Siberia outweighed wolves in Arabia. Humans in Scandinavia stood taller than humans in equatorial Africa. This pattern was so consistent across species that it became known as Bergmann's rule. And the reason behind it is pure physics. Bodies generate heat. That's just what warm-blooded animals do. We burn calories to maintain a constant internal temperature, whether it's freezing outside or scorching hot. But bodies also lose heat through their surface. The more surface area you have relative to your volume, the faster you lose heat to the environment. This is where geometry becomes destiny. Imagine a small cube and a large cube. The large cube has more volume, which means more mass generating heat. But crucially, its surface area doesn't increase as fast as its volume. A cube twice as wide has 8 times the volume but only 4 times the surface area. This means larger bodies are more efficient at retaining heat. They generate more warmth per unit of surface area through which heat can escape. In cold environments, this is exactly what you want. Your ancestors who migrated into Ice Age Europe or Northern Asia faced brutal winters, temperatures that could kill an unprepared human in hours. Any genetic variant that made bodies larger, more massive, better at holding on to precious metabolic heat, those variants spread like wildfire through the population. Over thousands of generations, natural selection sculpted northern populations into taller, broader, more robust forms. But the opposite pressure was acting on populations that stayed in the tropics. In hot, humid environments, the problem isn't staying warm. It's staying cool. Your body is constantly generating heat from metabolism, from muscle activity, from just being alive. In tropical climates, you need to dump that excess heat as efficiently as possible, which means you want more surface area relative to your volume. You want to be taller and leaner, with longer limbs that maximize the skin surface available for cooling. This is where Allen's rule comes in. Proposed in 1877 by Joel Asaph Allen, it states that animals in colder climates have shorter, stockier limbs, while those in warmer climates have longer, more slender appendages. Again, pure physics. Extremities, limbs, fingers, toes, they lose heat faster than the core body because they have high surface area and are far from the heat-generating organs. In cold climates, shorter limbs mean less heat loss. In hot climates, longer limbs mean more efficient cooling. Look at the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, the Inuit, the Sami populations that have lived in extreme cold for thousands of years. They tend to have compact builds, shorter limbs relative to torso length, broader chests. Their bodies are optimized for heat retention. Every aspect of their physiology has been sculpted by 20,000 years of sub-zero winters. Now look at the Dinka people of South Sudan or the Maasai of East Africa. Populations that have lived for millennia in some of the hottest regions on Earth. They're often extraordinarily tall, but lean, with long limbs and narrow frames. Their bodies are radiators, designed to shed heat as efficiently as possible under a relentless tropical sun. This isn't about one group being superior to another, it's about optimization. Each population adapted perfectly to its specific environment. A Dinka body is beautifully designed for the Sud marshlands. An Inuit body is masterfully engineered for the Arctic tundra, but swap their environments and both would struggle. The adaptations that make you perfect for one climate can become liabilities in another. The genetic changes underlying these adaptations happen surprisingly quickly. Studies of ancient DNA show that populations migrating into northern Europe began showing cold-adapted genetic variants within just a few thousand years. That's maybe 200 generations. In evolutionary terms, it's practically overnight. The selection pressure was that intense, but climate affects height in more subtle ways too. Consider altitude. Populations living at high elevations face unique challenges. The air is thinner, which means less oxygen with every breath. The UV radiation is more intense. Temperatures fluctuate wildly between day and night, and food resources tend to be more limited. These pressures create a different optimization problem. You need enough body mass to stay warm at night and generate sufficient red blood cells to process oxygen efficiently. But you also need to minimize your oxygen requirements because air is thin and every breath is precious. The solution that evolution found is fascinating. High-altitude populations tend to have larger chest cavities, giving them more lung capacity. But they're often shorter than lowland populations, reducing their overall oxygen needs. Look at the indigenous peoples of the Andes or the Tibetan Plateau. They've lived at elevations above 10,000 feet for thousands of years. They're typically shorter than their lowland cousins, but with barrel chests and extraordinary cardiovascular efficiency. Their bodies have been refined by altitude into oxygen processing machines, compact but powerful. Then there's sunlight. This might be the most important environmental factor in human height that nobody talks about. Sunlight doesn't just give you a tan. It triggers vitamin D synthesis in your skin. And vitamin D isn't just a vitamin, it's a hormone that regulates calcium absorption and bone growth. Without adequate vitamin D, bones don't develop properly. Children get rickets, adults get osteoporosis, and entire populations can see their average height stunted by several inches. This creates a vicious cycle in certain environments. Populations living in high latitudes where sunlight is weak and winters are long and dark need every bit of vitamin D they can synthesize. But darker skin, which evolved as protection against intense tropical sun, filters out the UV radiation needed to make vitamin D. When dark-skinned populations moved to northern regions, they faced a serious problem: not enough vitamin D, leading to bone development issues and reduced height. Natural selection responded by lightening skin in northern populations. Lighter skin allowed more UV penetration, which meant more vitamin D synthesis, which meant better bone development and greater height potential. This is why northern European populations, despite living in regions with limited sunlight, managed to become some of the tallest people on Earth. They evolved the skin tone necessary to maximize vitamin D production in a low-light environment. But even with the right skin tone, geography still matters. Populations living at extreme northern latitudes, where the sun barely rises in winter, historically struggled with vitamin D deficiency. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia traditionally relied heavily on vitamin D-rich foods like fish and reindeer to compensate for months of darkness. Without those dietary sources, their height potential would have been severely compromised. Access to sunlight also affects height through indirect pathways. Vitamin D influences immune function, and strong immune systems mean less childhood illness. Less illness means more consistent growth during critical developmental years. Populations living in environments with abundant sunlight and low disease burden could dedicate more resources to growth rather than constantly fighting infections. The pattern becomes clear when you map average heights against latitude and climate. There's a band of maximum heights running through northern Europe, particularly the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. These populations have cold enough climates to benefit from Bergmann's rule. They evolved light skin for maximum vitamin D synthesis, and they historically had access to protein-rich diets from fishing and dairy farming. Every factor aligned to promote maximum height. Move toward the equator and average heights decrease, not because tropical populations lack genetic potential for height, but because their bodies optimized for different priorities: heat dissipation, malaria resistance, efficiency in hot, humid conditions. In these environments, excessive height can actually be a disadvantage, making you a bigger target for heat stress and requiring more calories to maintain. Move to extreme northern latitudes beyond the optimal zone, and heights decrease again. Despite light skin allowing good vitamin D synthesis, the harsh conditions, limited growing seasons, and historically difficult food access impose their own constraints. You can have all the genetic potential in the world, but if the environment can't support it, that potential remains unexpressed. What's remarkable is how quickly these adaptations can shift when populations migrate. Studies of immigrants show that children born and raised in new environments often differ substantially in height from their parents. A family moving from a tropical region to a northern country will often see their children grow taller, not because their genes changed, but because the new environment, with its different diet, disease patterns, and climate, unlocked different aspects of their genetic potential. The human body is remarkably plastic, especially during childhood. The genes provide the blueprint, but the environment determines which parts of that blueprint get fully expressed. Climate, sunlight, altitude, disease burden, all of these environmental factors act like switches, turning height potential on or off, up or down, based on what the local conditions demand. We are, all of us, products of the places our ancestors inhabited, shaped by thousands of generations of selection pressure, molded by climates and geographies stretching back to those bottleneck survivors. Every population on Earth represents a successful solution to a specific environmental equation. Tall or short, broad or lean, long-limbed or compact, we're all perfectly adapted to somewhere. The question is whether that somewhere still matches where we live today. Here's something that doesn't show up in fossil records but shaped human height as much as any gene or diet: disease. Specifically childhood disease. And for most of human history, childhood was basically a minefield of infections, parasites, and illnesses that your body had to survive while simultaneously trying to grow. Think about what happens when a child gets sick, really sick. Not just a cold, but something serious: measles, typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis. The body goes into crisis mode. Every available calorie, every nutrient, every bit of energy gets diverted to the immune system. Fighting infection becomes the only priority. Growth can wait, except it can't wait forever. There's a developmental window for bone growth, particularly in the long bones of your legs and arms. These bones grow from specialized regions called growth plates, areas of cartilage that gradually ossify into solid bone as you mature. If you're malnourished or fighting infections during the key growth years, roughly from birth to age 18, those growth plates close without reaching their full genetic potential. And once they close, that's it. You don't get taller. Your DNA might have coded for 6 feet, but if you spent your childhood battling intestinal parasites and recurring fevers, you might top out at 5'6". Now multiply this across entire populations. For thousands of years, being a child meant being constantly sick. Archaeological evidence from medieval skeletons shows repeated lines of arrested growth in bones, called Harris lines. These are literally scars in your skeleton where growth stopped temporarily during periods of severe stress or illness, then resumed when you recovered. Most medieval skeletons show multiple Harris lines, 3, 4, sometimes 5 or 6 episodes where a child's growth just stopped completely. The average medieval European might have survived 3 or 4 serious illnesses before age 10: smallpox, plague, typhus, each one stealing weeks or months from their growth trajectory, each one permanently reducing their final adult height. Studies of skeletal remains from the Middle Ages show that average male height in Europe was around 5'6", about 4 inches shorter than modern Europeans. And these weren't different people genetically. These were the ancestors of modern Germans, French, Italians, British. Same genes, different diseases. The Black Death in the 14th century showed this effect in devastating clarity. Between 1347 and 1353, plague killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. That's 75 to 200 million people dead in just 6 years. But here's what's fascinating. The immediate survivors actually got slightly taller. For 1 or 2 generations after the plague, average height in Europe increased by about half an inch. Why? Because suddenly there was more food per person, more resources, less competition. The children born right after the plague grew up in a world where childhood nutrition was better than it had been in centuries. But this height gain was temporary. As populations recovered and resource competition increased again, average height dropped back down. The disease environment hadn't changed, just the population density. Parasites were even worse than acute infections. A child with intestinal worms, which was basically every child in pre-modern societies, was fighting a constant battle. Parasites don't want to kill you. They want to live off you. So they steal nutrients from your digestive system, triggering chronic inflammation, causing anemia, draining your body of exactly the resources it needs to grow. A child with a moderate parasite load might need 20 to 30% more calories just to maintain normal growth. In societies where food was already scarce, this meant stunted growth was essentially inevitable. Archaeological evidence from ancient Rome shows that despite living in one of history's most advanced civilizations, with aqueducts and public baths, and a relatively diverse diet, the average Roman was still only about 5'5" for men, 5'1" for women. Recent analysis of Roman skeletons shows widespread evidence of parasitic infections, including specific bone changes associated with chronic anemia from intestinal worms. They had the food, they had the infrastructure, but they were still losing inches to parasites. The situation wasn't universal, though. Some populations managed to partially escape the disease burden. Island populations, particularly in the Pacific, often grew taller than their mainland relatives, not because of better genetics or food, but because isolation meant fewer disease exposures. A child in pre-contact Polynesia faced far fewer infectious diseases than a child in medieval London. Same species, radically different disease environments, measurably different heights. Then came the great turning point, the 19th century sanitation revolution. Starting in the 1840s, European and American cities began installing sewer systems, cleaning up water supplies, establishing quarantine protocols. This wasn't done because anyone understood germ theory yet. Pasteur and Koch wouldn't prove the existence of infectious microorganisms until the 1860s and 70s. No, these sanitation improvements happened because cities were drowning in their own filth and people were dying in numbers that couldn't be ignored. But the effects were immediate and measurable. In cities that installed proper sewers and clean water systems, childhood mortality dropped by 30 to 40% within a decade. And the children who survived grew taller. Studies from Victorian London show that the average height of working-class boys increased by nearly 2 inches between 1850 and 1900. Not because of genetic changes, not because of dramatically better diets, primarily because they weren't constantly fighting cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. The 20th century accelerated this transformation. Vaccination, probably the single most important public health intervention in human history, began eliminating the major childhood diseases that had stolen inches from countless generations. Smallpox vaccine became widespread in the early 1900s. Diphtheria vaccine in the 1920s. Then came the antibiotic revolution. Penicillin in 1928, though not widely available until the 1940s, followed by a cascade of other antibiotics that could cure infections that had been death sentences for all of human history. The effect on height was dramatic. In the United States, average male height increased from about 5'7" in 1900 to 5'9" by 1960. That's 2 inches in 60 years. In the Netherlands, the transformation was even more striking. Dutch men averaged 5'7" in 1860. By 2000, they averaged 6'1", 4 inches in 140 years, making them the tallest population on Earth. And genetics played only a small role. Studies comparing Dutch immigrants to America with those who stayed in the Netherlands show that the environmental improvements in the Netherlands, particularly in public health, explained most of the height difference. What vaccination and antibiotics did was unlock genetic potential that had always been there. For thousands of years, human populations had been carrying genes for greater height, but those genes couldn't fully express themselves in bodies that were constantly fighting infections. It's like having a car capable of 150 miles per hour, but never getting to drive it faster than 50 because the road is full of potholes. Fix the road, and suddenly you discover what the car could always do. The deworming campaigns of the mid-20th century had similarly dramatic effects. When public health programs in the American South systematically treated children for hookworm and other parasitic infections in the 1920s and 30s, average height increased measurably within a single generation. Studies from the period show that children who received antiparasitic treatment grew on average 1 to 2 inches taller than their untreated siblings. Same families, same genes, different parasite loads. This pattern repeated across the developing world as public health infrastructure improved. Japan's average height increased by over 3 inches between 1950 and 1980, coinciding with the introduction of universal healthcare and childhood vaccination programs. South Korea showed similar gains. China is currently in the middle of this transition, with children born in the 2000s averaging 3 to 4 inches taller than their grandparents born in the 1950s. But here's what's really important to understand. These gains aren't permanent unless the health improvements are maintained. Height is responsive to environmental conditions within a single generation. If public health infrastructure collapses, heights decline. We saw this in North Korea during the famine of the 1990s. A generation of children grew up malnourished and diseased, and they ended up several inches shorter than their parents. The genetic potential was still there. The environment to express it was not. What the disease story teaches us is that human height isn't just about genes or nutrition in isolation. It's about whether a growing body can allocate resources to growth instead of constantly fighting off infections. It's about whether a child's immune system can rest occasionally instead of being in perpetual combat mode. It's about whether parasites are stealing half the nutrients from your intestines, or whether antibiotics can clear an infection in days instead of letting it drag on for months. For most of human history, disease was the hidden thief, stealing inches from billions of people who would never know how tall they could have been. The modern height explosion isn't because we evolved into a taller species. It's because we finally created an environment where our genes can do what they've always been capable of doing, where children can grow instead of just survive. We are living in the first era in human history where disease isn't the primary limiting factor on height, and we're still discovering just how tall humans can actually become when we remove that ancient constraint. Imagine pressing fast forward on human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, human height changed slowly, almost imperceptibly. A centimeter here, a centimeter there, gained or lost over thousands of years as diets shifted, climates wobbled, and diseases rose and fell. Then, suddenly, in the last 150 years, the graph doesn't drift, it bends, it shoots upward. If you lined up a European peasant from the year 1700, a factory worker from 1050, and a college student from 2000, the difference would be startling. On average, modern people in many countries are 10, 15, even 20 centimeters taller than their great-great-grandparents. That kind of change, in evolutionary terms, is violent. It usually takes millennia. We did it in a handful of generations. So what happened? Why did human bodies suddenly surge upward just as steam engines, railways, and electricity began rewiring the world? To understand it, you have to picture the Industrial Revolution not from the perspective of inventors and factory owners, but from the point of view of a child growing up inside it. You're born in a cramped brick house in a rapidly expanding city. The air smells of coal smoke and sewage. The streets are crowded. Water is drawn from shared pumps that sometimes run right next to open drains. Your parents work long hours in a textile mill or a mine. You might start working yourself at age 8 or 9, sometimes younger, feeding machines, hauling coal, or crawling through narrow tunnels. On paper, humanity has never been more powerful. Steamships cross oceans. Trains connect distant towns in hours instead of days. Factories churn out goods on a scale no one in history has seen before. But inside your body, a different story is unfolding. You're breathing polluted air. You're exposed to infectious diseases that spread easily in crowded neighborhoods. You're working long hours instead of running, playing, and sleeping. Your diet is monotonous. Bread, maybe potatoes, a little fat, the occasional scrap of meat. Fresh fruit and vegetables are rare in winter, expensive in summer. Milk might be watered down or contaminated. Clean water is not guaranteed. Under these conditions, your genes might say you could grow to 175 centimeters. Your environment says no. It drags you down to 160, maybe less. This is the paradox of early industrialization. Humanity invented machines that could harness the power of entire rivers and coal seams. But for the first few generations of factory workers, height didn't explode. In some places, it actually shrank. Historical records, military conscription data, and prison measurements from the 18th and early 19th centuries show stagnation or even declines in average stature for many urban populations. The Industrial Revolution was like a powerful amplifier. It magnified whatever system you fed into it. When you fed in poverty, crowding, and ignorance about disease, it amplified those too. But it also set the stage for something else. Because once societies started to understand what made people sick, what helped them grow, and how food and disease traveled through a population, the same industrial power that had crushed bodies in factories would be turned toward rebuilding them. The turning point came slowly, then all at once. Clean water systems, sewer networks, pasteurized milk, vaccines, labor laws limiting child work hours, mandatory schooling. Each of these sounds small, almost boring compared to stories of heroic kings or dramatic battles. But for human height, they were revolutionary weapons. Start with nutrition. Your body is a negotiation between energy used now and energy saved for later. If you're a growing child in a world of unpredictable food, your biology is cautious. It prioritizes keeping you alive today over making you tall tomorrow. Survive first. Flourish if there's anything left. For most of history, there wasn't much left. Famines, crop failures, seasonal shortages, all of these taught human bodies to be conservative with growth. Then, in the late 19th, and especially the 20th century, something new arrived: reliability. Railroads linked farms to cities. Steamships linked continents. Later, trucks and highways turned regions into tightly connected food webs. A crop failure in one province no longer meant universal hunger. Surpluses could be moved quickly. Grain, potatoes, and later meat and dairy could travel hundreds of miles without rotting. Then refrigeration entered the story, and human height quietly took notice. At first it was ice houses and ice blocks shipped from colder regions. Then came mechanical refrigeration, cold storage warehouses, refrigerated rail cars, then refrigerator trucks, and finally the glowing white box in almost every modern kitchen. Refrigeration did something subtle but profound. Suddenly, perishable foods, milk, fresh meat, eggs, fruits, vegetables could survive long enough to be eaten far from their point of origin. Cities no longer had to rely only on salted meat and root vegetables for most of the year. Protein and vitamins could be delivered consistently, not just in harvest season or to the very rich. For a growing child, this consistency changed everything. Bones need steady supplies of calcium, protein, vitamin D. Muscles demand amino acids. The immune system needs micronutrients to function. When those arrive in irregular bursts, your body plays it safe. When they arrive day after day, year after year, your body gets the message. It's okay to invest in height. It wasn't just more food, it was better food. More animal protein, more dairy, more diversity: wheat and rice and maize, potatoes and yams, leafy greens and citrus fruits, beans, nuts, oils. Diets that once leaned heavily on a single staple, like rye or millet, broadened into something much closer to what our hunter-gatherer ancestors enjoyed. Many different sources of energy and nutrients, available across most of the year. Now layer on top of this the quiet revolution in disease control. Children in the 19th century often battled multiple infections before their 5th birthday. Measles, whooping cough, tuberculosis, diarrheal diseases from contaminated water. Every infection is a drain on the body's resources. Fever, inflammation, tissue repair, all of this costs energy and nutrients. Repeated illnesses stunt growth, not just by damaging tissues directly, but by redirecting calories that could have gone into building bone and muscle. Public health measures changed that. Cleaner water, effective sewage, garbage collection, quarantine for outbreaks, then vaccines and antibiotics. Each step reduced the background noise of infection that had been humming in the human body for millennia. Fewer infections meant less energy wasted on emergency repairs, more available for building a tall, solid adult. And then there was time. A child's body needs more than food and cleanliness. It needs rest. It needs sleep. It needs play. It needs years of low-stress development to follow the growth blueprint written into its DNA. Early industrial societies had no patience for that. Children were workers. They labored in fields, in homes, in factories, in mines. Long hours, physical strain, and chronic fatigue are all forms of stress. Stress hormones tell your body, again, to prioritize survival over growth. Grow roots, not branches. When laws began to restrict child labor, banning very young children from factories, limiting work hours, mandating school attendance, a new environment took shape for growing bodies. Imagine, instead of 12 hours in a textile mill, you spend your childhood in a classroom with recess and lunch breaks, then come home to a hot meal, clean water, and a warm bed. You're still living in a world with problems, but your body reads a different set of signals. Less chronic stress, more sleep, more moderate physical activity, rather than crushing manual labor. The result shows up not just in exam scores or literacy rates, but in centimeters. When historians and anthropologists measure average heights over time, they see a clear pattern. As countries industrialize and then implement public health, nutrition, and labor reforms, The people born after these changes grow taller than any previous generation. Some of the most dramatic transformations happened in Northern and Western Europe. In the mid-19th century, the average Dutchman was not particularly tall by European standards. Today, the Netherlands has some of the tallest people on Earth. Over roughly 150 years, Dutchmen gained around 20 centimeters in average height. Women rose dramatically as well. Similar but slightly smaller increases appeared in Scandinavia. Japan offers another striking example. At the end of the 19th century, Japanese men were, on average, quite short compared to many Western populations. As the country modernized, improved sanitation, diversified diets, and increased access to animal protein, especially after World War II, produced a rapid height increase. In just a few generations, Japanese average height jumped by more than 10 centimeters. South Korea's story is even more compressed. In the mid-20th century, after war and widespread poverty, heights were low. Then came explosive economic growth, modernization of agriculture, school lunches, widespread vaccination, and urbanization. Children born in the late 20th century in South Korea are, on average, dramatically taller than their grandparents. One of the largest height gains recorded anywhere in such a short span. In southern Europe, countries like Spain and Italy, once relatively short, experienced similar leaps in the second half of the 20th century as post-war economies grew, diets improved, and healthcare expanded. Even within single countries, the pattern is clear. Rural children moving from subsistence farming to lives in cities with regular school meals, and medical care grew taller than their cousins who stayed behind in harsher conditions. The body is a sensitive historian. It records every calorie, every infection, every hour of sleep, and writes all of it into the final adult height. What's important here is that human genes didn't change much during this height explosion. The surge wasn't an evolutionary event in the strict genetic sense, it was an environmental one. The blueprint for tallness had always been there, scattered across populations. The modern world finally supplied the conditions that allowed that blueprint to be fully read. But this explosion was not, and is not, uniform. While some countries shot upward, others lagged behind. In places where poverty, conflict, and food insecurity remain common, average heights stay closer to historical levels. Even within wealthy countries, children from poorer families are still, on average, shorter than those from richer ones, a living reminder that the height revolution is incomplete. If you look at a modern city street, the tall buildings, the glowing signs, the cars and buses, it's easy to think the story of human height is about technology, about machines and medicine. But underneath all that, it's a simpler story. A story about whether a child can drink clean water, whether they can eat enough good food, not just sometimes but every day, whether they can sleep without fear, grow without working themselves to exhaustion, fight fewer infections, and live in a body that reads the world as safe enough to invest in the future. When those conditions lined up, starting in the 19th and exploding in the 20th century, human beings did something they'd rarely been allowed to do at scale. They stood up, fully. Now drift forward with me, far beyond the Ice Age, into a world that feels familiar. Skyscrapers instead of glaciers, supermarkets instead of mammoth herds, airplanes crossing the sky where migrating reindeer once walked. And yet, the story of height is still unfolding. Not in bones buried for 1,000,000 years, but in living bodies walking city streets right now. Your body, the people around you, the strangers at airports whose heads are just a little higher or lower than yours. If you could float above the planet and look down with an anthropologist's eyes, you'd see something striking. Humanity isn't one uniform species of 5-foot-something creatures. We're a patchwork of averages, some populations towering, others more compact. Some that have shot up dramatically in just a few generations, others left behind, still waiting for the growth spurt history promised, but never quite delivered. Let's start in a place that has puzzled scientists for decades. You're standing on a rainy street in Amsterdam. Bicycles whisper past. The canal water is black and still. Around you, people move by in coats and scarves, chatting, laughing, unlocking bikes. And one thing is immediately obvious. Everyone is tall. Not just a bit above average tall. On a global scale, the Dutch are outliers. Dutch men today average around 6 feet, or 183 centimeters. Dutch women average about 5'7", roughly 170 centimeters. A few hundred years ago, they were not giants. In fact, historical records suggest that in the 18th and early 19th centuries, Dutch people were shorter than many of their European neighbors. So what happened? Part of the answer is simple: prosperity. Over the last 150 years, the Netherlands became one of the wealthiest, most nutritionally secure countries on earth. Childhood infections dropped. Clean water became universal. Diets shifted to include more high-quality proteins: milk, cheese, meat, eggs. Remember that height is like a conversation between your genes and your environment. The Dutch always had the genes. In the 19th and 20th centuries, they finally gave those genes the perfect conditions to speak at full volume. But there's something stranger in the data. In the Netherlands, taller men and women have historically tended to have slightly more children than their shorter neighbors. That means natural selection didn't end with the Stone Age. It just changed form. In a modern, peaceful, well-fed society, where war and famine no longer decide who survives, subtle preferences in who marries whom can still nudge evolution along. Over generations, this steady, gentle pressure may have pushed average Dutch height upward, layer by layer, like sediment building at the bottom of a lake. Now, step away from Amsterdam. Imagine the map of the world spreading out beneath you again. In Europe, you see a band of relative tallness stretching across the north and center of the continent. The Dutch, the Scandinavians, people from Montenegro, Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia. Average male heights in some of these regions rival or even surpass the Dutch. Further south and east, averages gradually dip. Not because Southern Europeans or Middle Easterners are somehow less evolved, but because centuries of different diets, disease loads, and economic conditions shape their bodies differently. Cross the Atlantic. In the United States, something unexpected appears. In the mid-20th century, Americans were among the tallest people on Earth. But since then, their position in the global rankings has slipped. Not because they've shrunk, but because others have raced ahead. Northern and Central Europeans kept getting taller. Americans, especially from poorer backgrounds, began to level off. Height here reveals an uncomfortable truth. S is rich, but health and nutrition are unevenly distributed. Childhood obesity, ultra-processed diets, patchy healthcare access, all these act like invisible hands, pressing down on potential height in many communities. In a single American city, you can find neighborhoods where children grow up close to Dutch averages, and others where kids, with the same biological potential, end up several centimeters shorter because of chronic stress, poorer diets, and more frequent illness. Fly south, over the equator, into Latin America, the picture becomes more complex. In countries like Chile, Brazil, and Mexico, average heights have been rising steadily, especially among younger generations growing up in cities with better sanitation and more diverse food. But indigenous communities, rural populations, and urban poor often remain significantly shorter, not because their genes are different, but because opportunity is. Remember, a population's average height is not a judgment, it's a record. A quiet biological archive of how safe childhood was, how clean the water, how abundant the protein, how frequent the infections. Now curve eastward, across the Pacific, to a pair of countries that rewrote the global height map in a single human lifetime. Japan, South Korea. Stand in Tokyo in 1900 and look around. At that time, Japanese men averaged about 5'3", or 160 centimeters. Today, they stand close to 5'7", about 171 centimeters. 14 centimeters of growth in just over a century. That's not slow Darwinian evolution, that's living memory. South Korea's story is even more dramatic. At the end of the Korean War, the country was among the poorest on Earth. Food was scarce. Childhood stunting was common. But as the South Korean economy exploded in the late 20th century, so did its people literally. Between the 1950s and today, average heights in South Korea have climbed by more than 10 centimeters. The children of a generation that knew hunger grew up in a world of school lunches, public health campaigns, and exploding urban prosperity. Their bones responded. This is what happens when you flip almost every lever of growth at once. Clean water, vaccines, sanitation, education, and a diet suddenly rich in animal proteins, grains, fruits, and vegetables. It's as if a population had been walking around with the brakes on its genetic potential for centuries, and then, within a few decades, someone took their foot off the pedal. But the story isn't uniform even within these success stories. In both Japan and South Korea, rural-urban differences still exist. Wealthier families tend to have taller children than poorer ones. The same pattern repeats like an echo all over the planet. Zoom back out. Across much of Western Europe, East Asia, and parts of the Middle East, average heights have climbed steadily over the last 100 years, tracking economic growth almost like a shadow. When gross domestic product rises, childhood mortality falls, calorie quality improves, and a generation or two later, the adults are taller. But now look at regions where that economic tide has been weaker or more uneven. In parts of South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Nepal average heights remain relatively low compared to their genetic potential. Indian men, for example, average several centimeters shorter than men in Europe or East Asia, despite evidence from diaspora communities that Indian genes are fully capable of reaching those heights when raised in resource-rich environments like the UK, Canada, or the United States. Sub-Saharan Africa tells a similar, yet more fragmented story. Some populations, especially in urban centers and more stable countries, have seen gradual increases in height. Others, particularly in regions repeatedly hit by conflict, drought, or economic crisis, have stagnated or even declined. Here, height becomes a biological seismograph, picking up the tremors of political instability and climate stress. The pattern is stark but consistent. Where children are healthy, well-nourished, vaccinated and protected from chronic stress, they grow. Where they are not, they don't. This is the lingering height gap between wealthy and developing nations. You can see it in airport queues, in migrant communities, in sports teams at international competitions. But it's not destiny. It's history, economics, and public health made visible. Now, add one more ingredient to this global story: migration. For most of our past, human populations evolved relatively locally. A valley here, a coastline there, a mountain plateau somewhere else. Genetic variants affecting height tended to cluster in regions for thousands of years. Natural selection operated within those boundaries, fine-tuning bodies to local diets, climates, and disease environments. In the modern world, those boundaries are dissolving. Imagine a child born in London or Toronto or Sydney today. Their mother might be Nigerian, their father Dutch. Their grandparents could come from Pakistan, Italy, China, Mexico, or Jamaica. In a single generation, gene pools that took millennia to separate are being recombined. Studies of migrant families show a recurring pattern. When people move from poorer countries to wealthier ones, their children tend to grow taller than the parents, sometimes dramatically so. A first-generation immigrant mother from Guatemala, raised with chronic childhood infections and borderline malnutrition, might stand 150 centimeters tall. Her daughter, growing up in Los Angeles with vaccinations, clean water, and school meals, might reach 160 or 165 centimeters without any change in genetic ancestry at all. Environmental brakes removed, potential released. Over time, as generations mix and intermarry, these hat-affecting genes will flow across populations just like other traits: eye color, hair texture, skin tone. Globalization is weaving the once separate threads of human variation back together into something new. But environment still matters. A child of tall ancestry raised in a slum may never reach that genetic potential. A child of shorter ancestry raised in optimal conditions may surpass the height of almost everyone in their family tree. Genes load the gun. Environment pulls the trigger. Society decides who gets to stand in front of the target. As you lie here, Maybe in a bed in a city lit by sodium lamps and phone screens, your own height is a kind of quiet record. It remembers things you don't. The illnesses you had or didn't have as a toddler. The nutrients hidden in your childhood meals. The stress levels in your household, written in cortisol and growth hormone. The prosperity or poverty of your neighborhood. The policies of your government. The rise or fall of your country over the last 100 years. When you look around the world and see that the Dutch are the tallest, that Japanese and South Koreans have surged upward in a century, that children in some nations still grow up short for their age, you're not just seeing differences in biology. You're seeing the afterimage of wars and peace treaties, famines and green revolutions, vaccines and clean water projects, shipping routes and school milk programs. You're seeing history written on the body, and the story isn't finished. New migrations, new inequalities, new forms of prosperity and crisis are still reshaping the human frame, which raises one final question. If height has changed this much in just a few thousand years, what comes next? Picture the world not as it is now, but as a slow-motion time-lapse. Cities dissolving, forests creeping in, mountains eroding grain by grain. Generations flicker past like candle flames. Bodies are born, grow, shrink with age, and vanish. But the question hanging over all of them is the same. Where does this end? Do humans just keep getting taller, or have we already hit the ceiling? For most of the last 150 years, height has felt like an arrow pointing straight up. In country after country, especially in Europe and parts of East Asia, average heights rose dramatically. Children who would once have been stunted by disease and malnutrition suddenly had enough calories, clean water, and medical care. Bones lengthened, growth plates stayed open longer, and adolescent bodies quietly stretched toward the sky. But when you zoom in on the last few decades, the story changes. In many of the richest nations, the lines are flattening. The Dutch, who once seemed destined to become giants, have stopped getting taller. In some age groups, they've even started shrinking by a centimeter or two. In the United States, average height has barely budged since the mid-20th century, even as people have become heavier. Japan's post-war growth spurt in height has leveled off. South Korea's spectacular climb from some of the shortest to some of the tallest in East Asia is now slowing. It's as if we've been racing uphill for more than a century, only to suddenly find ourselves on a long, flat plateau. Why? Because height isn't just a number. It's a negotiation between genes and environment. Once children consistently get enough nutrition, avoid most serious infections, and have access to basic healthcare, the body begins to push up against what those genes will allow. Extra calories don't add extra inches anymore, they just add extra weight. Better medicine stops people from dying, but it doesn't necessarily make them any taller. In other words, for many populations, we may be brushing against something like a biological ceiling. Not a hard stop, not a wall of brick, but a fuzzy upper limit, set by thousands of genes interacting with thousands of environmental variables. Every person has a genetic height range, a window of possibility. If conditions are bad, chronic stress, parasites, famine, you end up near the bottom of that window. If conditions are excellent, you inch toward the top. For much of history, humans were stuck near the floor of their potential. The 19th and 20th centuries' clean water, vaccinations, better diets pushed entire populations upward, closer to the top of their genetic range. Once you get there, improvements can still happen, but they're small, subtle, and slow. A few millimeters here, a fraction of a centimeter there, spread over generations. So the plateau in developed nations might not mean we've hit an absolute maximum for our species. It might just mean that most people in those countries are already close to their personal limits. But evolution is sneaky, and the world is changing again. In some regions, especially parts of Africa and South Asia, children are still climbing out of the nutritional and medical deficits that pressed their ancestors down. As health systems improve and diets diversify, we can expect average heights there to keep rising for a while. Global height won't move in a straight line, it will ripple, population by population, as each group's environment catches up with its genetic potential. Meanwhile, the very conditions that once made humans taller are beginning to shift in new, complicated ways. Think about the diets of the future. For most of our evolutionary history, food scarcity was the problem. Now, in many places, the challenge is the opposite: too much food of the wrong kind. Ultra-processed diets full of sugar and fat, but short on micronutrients. Cheap calories that fill bellies but don't properly build bones. You can have obesity and undernourishment in the same body. A child who eats plenty but rarely gets enough protein, calcium, or vitamins may grow outward instead of upward. Their height potential is there, locked in the genome, but the key's nutrient density, stable sleep, low stress are missing. Then there's lifestyle. Our ancestors walked, climbed, carried, and roamed. Today, many children sit. They sit at desks, in cars, on couches, hunched over glowing screens. Their skeletons still grow, but they grow in a world where movement is optional, posture is often poor, and circadian rhythms are disrupted by artificial light that never really goes away. Chronic stress from economic pressure, social anxiety, unstable environments adds another invisible weight. Stress hormones can interfere with growth, nudging the body to prioritize survival over height. The result might not be dramatic shrinkage, just a quiet loss of what might have been. A centimeter less here, 2 centimeters less there. Millions of tiny compromises accumulated over a generation. So the future of human height may be a tug-of-war. Better medicine, better knowledge, and targeted nutrition pulling one way. Sedentary lifestyles, processed diets, and chronic stress pulling the other. And hovering behind all of this is a new possibility our ancestors never had: direct editing of the genes themselves. For hundreds of thousands of years, height was shaped by natural selection and random mutation. You didn't choose your genes, you received them, a genetic lottery ticket printed long before you were born. Now, for the first time in history, we are learning to reach into that lottery machine and rearrange the numbers. Genetic engineering, CRISPR, and the technologies that will follow opens a door that was once sealed shut. If a society decides it values height, truly values it, more than we do today, it might not wait for another century of better nutrition and quieter stress. It might try to adjust the blueprint directly, not tomorrow, not next year. But eventually, in theory, parents could one day select embryos not just to avoid serious diseases, but to nudge height upward by a few centimeters. Change a handful of variants here, tweak another cluster there, and suddenly the child's predicted adult height shifts from average to tall. A whole generation could be built with height as one of the preferred traits, like eye color or intelligence. But genes are never that simple. The variants that influence height don't act alone. They tangle with genes for metabolism, bones, blood vessels, even the brain. Increase height too aggressively, and you might also increase the risk of joint problems, blood clots, or heart strain. Taller bodies mean more tissue to supply with oxygen, more distance for blood to travel, more load on knees, hips, and spine. Being tall has always been a trade-off. On one side of the scale, taller people tend to have advantages in certain sports, in physical reach, in some social and economic arenas where height is subconsciously associated with power or leadership. In populations that once faced frequent violence or needed to intimidate rivals, these subtle advantages could add up over time. On the other side, extreme height comes with costs, higher rates of some cancers, increased risk of blood clots, mechanical strain on joints and the cardiovascular system. Very short stature can bring its own medical challenges, but very tall bodies are also walking compromises with physics and biology. Evolution doesn't care about tall for its own sake. It only cares about what helps genes survive and reproduce. If being slightly taller helps in one environment, the average creeps up. If being too tall becomes a burden, harder births, more injuries, more disease, the average gets pulled back down. So if future humans start deliberately engineering themselves to be taller, they'll be stepping into a delicate balancing act that natural selection has been rehearsing for millions of years. They may discover that there isn't a perfect height, just a shifting sweet spot different in each environment, each culture, each technological era. What then might our descendants look like centuries from now? Imagine a world 500 years ahead. In some regions, climate change has redrawn coastlines and shifted weather patterns. Food systems have had to adapt. New crops, lab-grown protein, precision nutrition tailored to individual genomes. Childhood malnutrition has declined, but so has physical labor. Most people work with their minds and fingertips, not with their muscles. In one scenario, average height barely changes. We hover around the same range we see today, perhaps a little taller in places where early life conditions are nearly perfect, a little shorter where environmental stresses remain. The human body stabilizes around a form that's already been tried and tested across multiple climates and lifestyles. The big changes happen inside the brain, the immune system, the metabolism, while outwardly, we look reassuringly familiar. In another scenario, subtle, slow shaping continues. Populations in dense megacities living in stacked apartments and tight transit systems might find that being very large is a disadvantage. Smaller bodies fit more easily into small spaces, require fewer calories, and add less strain to infrastructure. If such environments last long enough, and if they influence who has the most children, average height in those regions could gently drift downward. Meanwhile, in other areas perhaps where manual work, sports, or defense remain central to culture, and survival height might stay the same or inch upward, especially if technologies allow safe, controlled genetic tweaking. Humanity could diverge not into different species, but into subtly different body norms, each molded by a unique blend of environment, culture, and technology. Or perhaps the biggest surprise will be how little height matters once other levers are in our hands. When medicine can repair joints, bolster hearts, and optimize blood flow, the penalties of being very tall might shrink. When exoskeletons and robotic aids become ordinary, shorter stature might not limit physical tasks at all. And when more of our lives unfold in digital or virtual spaces, where height can be adjusted with a slider, the psychological weight of being tall or short might fade. In that kind of world, the future of human height might not be growth or decline or even a plateau. It might be diversity, a wide range of body types, each viable, each supported by technology, each chosen or accepted rather than simply inherited. For now, though, we live in a brief, interesting moment. We carry the legacy of a past where height meant survival advantages and environmental burdens. We stand at the edge of a future where we can reshape both bodies and environments in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. And we balance, right now, between those two forces still partly shaped by ancient selection, already nudged by modern science. As you lie there, letting your own body sink into the mattress, your spine slowly decompressing, your vertebrae drifting just a little farther apart with each calm breath, you're living proof of this long, unfinished experiment. You are as tall as a particular mix of genes and childhood experiences allowed you to be. Your children, or their children, may stand a little taller, or a little shorter, or exactly the same. They may inherit edited genes, precision diets, or environments we can barely imagine. But whatever shape they take, they will still be part of this same story. A species forever testing the limits of its own design, forever negotiating between what is possible, what is practical, and what is wise, forever wondering, in the quiet of the night, how far can we really grow? So now, as the story slows down and the lights of deep time fade into the dark, you can look at your own body and see a quiet record of all of this written into your bones. Once we were small, cautious creatures, not quite upright, not quite human, moving through forests where every shadow was a threat and every meal had to be earned with risk. Our height then was a compromise. Shorter legs for climbing, lower centers of gravity for balance, bodies built for gripping branches, not crossing horizons. Then, step by slow step, we stood up. Bipedalism didn't happen in an afternoon. It crept into our hips, our spines, our ankles. As we leaned into walking on two legs, our bodies stretched vertically. Hips narrowed, legs lengthened, feet became arches instead of grasping hands. Every extra inch of height was a tiny bet placed on the new way of living, seeing further over the grass, carrying food, tools, and children through a changing world. Diet added its own verse to the story. When our ancestors cracked open marrow bones and learned to cook, They unlocked energy that taller, more demanding bodies could use. When they scavenged carcasses and hunted in coordinated groups, height became part of a hunting strategy, striding across savannas, tracking herds, throwing spears. Later, when farming arrived, height rose and fell again like the seasons. Good harvests, rich soils, diverse crops bodies grew taller. Famine, monoculture, and disease bodies shrank, vertebrae compressed, growth plates closed early. Every century left its signature in average height. Genes were there the whole time, like the quiet scribes of evolution. Environment, food, and health chose which parts of that script would actually be read. The same genetic blueprint could build a tall frame with enough protein and safety, or a smaller one when calories were scarce and infections relentless. Your own height is just one of countless outcomes that your genes were prepared to build, depending on the world they found themselves in. Climate nudged us too. Cold regions favored shorter, stockier bodies that held in heat. Hot, open landscapes tended to favor longer limbs that could shed warmth more easily. Mountains, coasts, islands, plains, each geography whispered a slightly different instruction to growing bones. Our ancestors listened without knowing they were listening, their bodies adjusting, generation after generation, to match the landscapes they walked. Disease moved through this story like a hidden editor, parasites stealing nutrients, childhood infections slowing growth, plagues thinning populations, changing who survived long enough to raise children. When clean water, vaccinations, and better medicine finally arrived in the past 2 centuries, they did something astonishing. Without changing our basic genes much at all, they allowed those genes to express their full potential. That's when human height suddenly surged. In a few generations, in some countries, average people grew taller than many kings and warriors of the past. So when you think about height, you're not just thinking about centimeters or inches. You're thinking about migration and campfires, famines and feasts, winters that lasted too long, summers that saved villages, parents giving the best food to their children, and grandparents passing down stories about lean years and lucky rains. Height is a quiet biography of civilization, written not in books, but in the proportions of our bodies. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might let your mind wander back through that long lineage. From small, cautious apes in the trees, to upright wanderers on the savannah, to farmers, sailors, city dwellers, astronauts. Every step along the way, our average height shifting a little, reflecting what the world was asking of us at that moment in time. And now here you are, a single human in a specific place on this planet, listening to this story in the dark. Your height, whatever it is a perfectly valid answer to millions of years of questions the Earth has been asking our species. There is no right height, only the one that your genes, your childhood, your culture, and your environment created together. If you're still awake and your eyes aren't too heavy yet, you're welcome to gently tap like on this video, or subscribe so you can find your way back to more stories like this whenever you need them. If you'd like, you can also leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from, curled up in a city apartment, out in the countryside, by the ocean, in the mountains. It's a quiet way of mapping our own little metapopulation across the globe. There's also an option to join our channel membership here on YouTube, for those who want to support these long, calming journeys through history. It's completely optional only if it feels right for you. Your presence here, listening, is already more than enough. For now, let the tall tale of humanity fade into the background. Let the timelines stretch out and recede, your breath slow and steady, your body exactly the height it needs to be in this moment, and the long, improbable story of our species still unfolding as you gently drift off to sleep.